All right, so this is the second half of the chapter State, Bureaucracy, and Class from Hal Draper's theory, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, Volume 1, The State and Bureaucracy. And this half is starting with a new section, Section 4, titled The Bureaucracy in Bourgeois Society. It is this process of social bourgeoisification which, in Marx's view, changes the autonomous role played by the state bureaucracy. The new bourgeois society had to subordinate the state bureaucracy to itself, to the new ruling class of civil society. It had to break the tradition of autonomy established by the special conditions of absolutism. The bourgeoisification of the bureaucrats was a means toward the political subordination of the bureaucracy. The change can be summarized as follows. In the highly autonomized state of the absolute monarchy, the bureaucracy had been in position to act as a class element in terms of the specific structure of that society. But insofar as the bourgeoisie gained more and more social and political power in the bourgeoisie's own name, thereby taking over direct command of the state, the bureaucracy was reduced more and more to the status of a social stratum acting merely as the agent of the ruling class. This is the status it tends to be restricted to, as a rule, wherever the ruling class of a given society is still robust enough to exercise unchallenged socioeconomic and political sway. In this sense, it is its normal status. Footnote. This suggests why the class status of the bureaucracy has again become a moot question in the contemporary world, which sees the down phase of bourgeois society and the increasing prevalence of autonomized state phenomena. It is this phase that is prefigured in the Bonapartist elements discussed in chapters 14 to 19. The above formulation of the, quote, normal status of the bureaucracy was later turned into a suprahistorical law by, quote, Marxist dogma. End footnote. In the United States, which had started in a more or less bourgeois basis without evolving through feudalism, Marx noted that, quote, the state, in contradistinction from all earlier national formations, was subordinated from the first to bourgeois society and bourgeois production, and could never make the claim of being an end in itself. End quote. Marx in the Grundrisse. For Marx, this new relationship under bourgeois conditions in the, quote, modern state first came to the fore in the German ideology, as we saw in chapter 8. There, Marx's exposition of the class nature of the state was already applied to a social order taken, by anticipation, as already bourgeois in essentials, even though the retarded actuality in Germany was fully recognized in other sections of the same book. The thesis about the change in the role of the bureaucracy was set down by Marx in so many words in his 1849 speech to the Cologne jury, in the midst of the passage already cited. The crown had been linked with, quote, the old feudal bureaucratic society, end quote, and represented, quote, the feudal aristocratic society, end quote, as against, quote, a modern bourgeois society, end quote. Quote, it inheres in the conditions of existence of the latter, bracket, modern bourgeois society, end bracket, that bureaucracy and army, instead of being masters of commerce and industry, be reduced to their tools, and be made into mere organs of bourgeois business relations, bracket, Werker, end bracket. It cannot be tolerated that agriculture be restricted by feudal privilege, or industry by bureaucratic tutelage, ... It must subordinate the treasury administration to the needs of production, while the old state had to subordinate production to the needs of the crown by the grace of God, and to shoring up the pillars of royalty, the social props of this crown, ... In modern society, there are still classes. In modern society, there are still classes, but no longer estates. End quote. Marx, before Cologne jury. We have seen that the thesis was repeated in passing in Marx's 18th Brumaire. Until 1814 to 1815, the bureaucracy was historically a means of, quote, preparing bourgeois class rule. But with the bourgeois monarchy born in July 1830, and still more with the Second Republic in 1848, the bureaucracy became the, quote, instrument of the ruling class. To be sure, this downgraded bureaucracy still, quote, strove for power of its own, end quote, adds Marx in the same work. This reminder is necessary since the bureaucrats' strivings by no means disappear from history. Caliban continues to mutter, quote, I must obey, his art is of such power, ... end quote, but adds, quote, and yet I needs must curse, ... sometimes am I, all wound with adders, who with cloven tongues do hiss me into madness, end quote. Caliban. The servant monster cries throughout the subsequent history of the bourgeoisie, quote, a plague upon the tyrant that I serve, end quote, while he dreams of riches and a return to power. Caliban drunk seeks a new master, and in the next tempest, the Caliban state did find a new god to worship in the form of Louis Bonaparte. With this new master, the state machine took off at a zigzag angle away from the straight course which history rarely follows. The bureaucracy was conjuncturally able to tear itself free again. Quote, only under the second Bonaparte, end quote, wrote Marx, quote, does the state seem to have made itself completely independent, end quote. Marx, 18th Brumaire. With this contrast, Marx asserted that under the regime of Louis Bonaparte, the state was more autonomous than ever before, more so even than under the absolute monarchy. It was not dominated by any ruling class of civil society. But even in this case, quote, the state power is not suspended in midair, end quote. Marx cautions in the next paragraph, this power rests on the support of the peasantry, the support or toleration of sectors of the bourgeoisie, and above all, on the precarious equilibrium of the bourgeois-proletarian antagonism, the frozen class struggle. This highly autonomized state is not the, quote, instrument of any one of the propertied classes contending for political power, but this highly autonomized state is still the result of class society taken as a whole. But this highly autonomized state is still the resultant of class society taken as a whole in its current constellation of countervailing powers. We thus get behind the formula version of Marx's theory to find that even in this abnormal situation, the class conception of the state is as central as ever. Footnote. This is the conception that Engels more than once presented as being the basic formulation of the theory of the state, a more all-embracing formulation than the narrower sort of, quote, normal case, where the state acts as the managing committee of a, as in singular, ruling class, in a more or less stable situation. We saw Engels make the same point in explaining the complex class basis of Bismarckian Bonapartism. Quote, in reality, however, the state as it exists in Germany is likewise the necessary product of the social basis out of which it has developed, end quote. Engels made the point even more sharply in connection with a similar test case, a non-bourgeois government in process of forcing the development of capitalism, absolutist Russia. This case is reserved for fuller discussion in Chapter 23. End footnote. Furthermore, the Bonapartist state power, quote, is not suspended in midair. One second. Sorry about that. Furthermore, the Bonapartist state power, quote, is not suspended in midair, end quote, in terms of its own social orientation. It does not set itself against the ruling socioeconomic powers of civil society. On the contrary, it strives to be accepted by the latter, to be accepted as the managing committee of class society taken as a whole. And one of the decisive issues of the period will be whether it can impose itself in this capacity on the reluctant bourgeoisie. It should then be clear that in terms of Marx's historical method, the abstract question, is the bureaucracy a class, is a little better than, quote, how high is up, end quote. An answer can be considered only in terms of a specific social order at a given historical stage. If Marx had no trouble explaining that the state bureaucracy of Friedrich Wilhelm III functioned as a class in the framework of the estate structure of the Prussian absolute monarchy, Marx also had no doubt that the triumph of the bourgeoisie normally produced social relations in which the state bureaucracy was demoted to a status too amorphous and ancillary to claim a class role. The same conclusion about the role of the bureaucracy under capitalism was approached from the economic side in Marx's manuscripts of the fourth volume of Capital. Here Marx is concerned with the state officialdom as one of those social strata that consist of people who do unproductive labor but are nevertheless useful to the ruling class in some way. These strata are collectively labeled, quote, the ideological, etc. classes, end quote. And one of the passages to be cited, and the, quote, ideological Stände, end quote, in another, end parenthesis. The question under discussion in this context is the revenue devoted by the bourgeoisie to maintaining these strata, hence the bourgeoisie's original objection to the expense of maintaining them, and its subsequent reconciliation to this expense. Quote, political economy in its classical period, just like the bourgeoisie itself in the bourgeoisie's parvenu period, parvenu meaning be like a young up-and-comer, is like of obscure origin, I think it usually means, took a severe and critical attitude toward the state machinery, etc. Later, the bourgeoisie saw, and as was also shown in practice, learned by experience, that was out of its own organization that the necessity arose for the inherited societal combination of all these classes, which were in part quite unproductive, end quote. I think that's from Marx's Series of Surplus Value, Volume 1. With this realization, the bourgeoisie became willing to justify even, quote, the exaggerated demands, end quote, of the bourgeoisie's defenders, and, quote, the dependence of the ideological, etc. classes on the capitalist was in fact proclaimed. The dependence of the ideological, etc. classes on the capitalist was in fact proclaimed, end quote. Marx. Marx then quotes a notable passage from Adam Smith lumping the whole state officialdom among the unproductive laborers, along with the men of the church and the intellectual professions, as well as, quote, players, buffoons, and so on. He explains, quote, "This is the language of the still revolutionary bourgeoisie, which has not yet subjected the whole of society, state, etc., to that bourgeoisie's self. These illustrious and time-honored occupations, sovereign, judges, officers, priests, etc., the aggregate of all the old ideological strata, Stände, arising out of them, their men of learning, teachers and priests, are economically speaking put on par with the swarm of their own lackeys and jesters, or economically speaking put on a par with the swarm of their own lackeys and jesters, These occupations are mere, quote, servants of the, quote, public, just as the others are their, quote, servants, State, church, etc. are justified only insofar as state, church, etc. are committees for the management or administration of the common interest of the productive bourgeoisie, But as soon as the bourgeoisie has conquered the terrain, in part itself taking over the state and in part making a compromise with its former possessors, as soon as it has acknowledged the ideological strata, Stände, to breathe flesh of its flesh, and has everywhere transformed them into its functionaries in accordance with its own nature, as soon as the intellectual tasks themselves are more and more carried out in its service, entering into the service of capitalist production, then taking a new tack, the bourgeoisie seeks to justify, quote, economically, end quote, from its own standpoint, what it previously had critically opposed, end quote. Marx theories of surplus value. Even where in other cases Marx emphasizes the autonomous importance of the bureaucratic apparatus, Marx does not forget that, under bourgeois relationships, its power, after all, is limited to a subordinate sphere. We saw such a case in Marx's apparently sweeping identification of, quote, the permanent and irresponsible bureaucracy, end quote, of, quote, creatures of the desk, end quote, and, quote, obstinate old clerks, end quote, staffing India House as, quote, the real home government, end quote, of British India. But before the end of this tirade against bureaucratism, it is made clear that the power of the state is wielded by the British, quote, oligarchy and, quote, moneyocracy, end quote, and it is under their aegis that, quote, a subordinate bureaucracy paralyzes its, India's, end administration, and perpetuates its abuses as the vital condition of their own perpetuation, end quote. Marx. The, quote, abject, bureaucratic, quote, oddfellows, end quote, reigned over the administration, but did not rule. The same view is implicit in a sketch of the British bureaucracy in India itself, written a few years later. New section. The question of class provenance. The question of class provenance. The autonomized hierarchy, quote, is not suspended in mid-air, end quote, in another respect. With regard to its class composition, this important question of the class provenance of the bureaucracy was first discussed at some length in an important manuscript of an unfinished educational pamphlet by Engels in 1847. Let us follow its line of thought. German backwardness is shown by the dominance of agriculture. On the land, dominance is held by the aristocracy. Below the aristocracy and dependent on the aristocracy is the petty bourgeoisie, small property owners, artisans, and so on. The poorly developed bourgeoisie still counts officially only alongside the petty bourgeoisie. What political structure results? Quote, the present constitution of Germany is nothing more than a compromise between the aristocrats and the petty bourgeois, which is tantamount to turning over governmental administration to the hands of a third class, the bureaucracy. The two high contracting parties share in the makeup of this class in accordance with their mutual position. The aristocrats, who represent the more important branch of production, reserve for themselves the higher positions. The petty bourgeoisie is content with the lower ones and gets only exceptional candidates into the higher echelons of administration. Where the bureaucracy is subjected to a direct control, as in the constitutional state of Germany, the aristocrats and petty bourgeois share in it in the same way, and it is easy to understand that here, too, the aristocracy reserves the lion's share for itself. End quote. Engels, status quo in Germany. Engels then asks, quote, now, how does the German bourgeoisie stand in relation to the two classes that share in the political rule? End quote. Engels. It would seem that the aristocracy and the petty bourgeoisie, quote, share in the political rule, end quote, in proportion to their contribution to the formation of the bureaucracy, which, however, functions as, quote, a third class, end quote, the one that runs the government. Is this bureaucratic class merely derived from the two classes dominant in civil society, or is it more basically conditioned by its derivation? How autonomous is this peculiar class with respect to the other two? Engels' pamphlet is concerned with quite other problems, not these, but Engels' picture of Germany clearly expresses the conception that no single class has managed to achieve ruling status as yet. Quote, the wretchedness of the German status quo consists principally in the fact that no single class has so far been strong enough to put its own sector of production forward as the national one par excellence, and thereby put itself forward as the representative of the interests of the whole nation, ... This regime represented by the bureaucracy is the political compendium of the general impotence and contemptible meanness, the stuffy tediousness and the filth of German society. End quote. Engels, the status quo in Germany. The thrust is, in hindsight, plainly toward the view, more clearly formulated later, of the, quote, bureaucratic monarchy, end quote, as the result of an equilibrium of class forces, producing a highly autonomized bureaucracy. As Marx did in his article of the same year, Engels proceeds to emphasize strongly that this bureaucratic state power is a fetter on the development of the progressive class, the bourgeoisie, whose decisive section is the manufacturing capitalists. Quote, the manufacturers, however, are hampered in the full utilization of their capital not only by inadequate tariffs, but also by the bureaucracy. If they are confronted with indifference in the matter of tariff legislation, they are here, in their relation to the bureaucracy, confronted with the very direct hostility of the government. The bureaucracy has been established to rule petty bourgeois and peasants. ... The petty bourgeois and peasants, therefore, cannot do without a powerful and numerous bureaucracy. They must let themselves be kept in tutelage in order to avoid the greatest confusion, in order not to be ruined by hundreds and thousands of lawsuits. But the bureaucracy, which is a necessity for the petty bourgeois, very soon becomes an intolerable fetter on the bourgeois. The officialdom's surveillance and interference become very irksome already in manufacturing. The manufacturing industry is hardly possible under such supervision. Up to now, the German manufacturers have kept the bureaucracy off their necks as much as possible by bribery, for which they certainly cannot be blamed, end quote. Engels, Status Quo in Germany. There is more about, quote, the bureaucratic hatred of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Then comes an important statement about the change in the status of the bureaucracy that would result from bourgeois political victory. Quote, the bourgeoisie is therefore compelled to break the power of this arrogant and double-dealing bureaucracy. From the moment that the running of the state and legislation come under the control of the bourgeoisie, the independence of the bureaucracy collapses. Indeed, from that moment, the torments of the bourgeois turn into their submissive servitors. End quote. Engels, The Status Quo in Germany. All this ties in with the main argument of Engels' pamphlet, which was directed against the, quote, feudal socialist, end quote, whose anti-bourgeois fervor pushed them to look with favor on the monarchical regime. In the course of this argument, it is the state bureaucracy that emerges as the main political obstacle to social progress at the given point in history. After the revolution, Engels had another go at the question of the class provenance of an absolutist bureaucracy and its relation to civil society. The subject is Austria, and perhaps this exposition is clearest because the situation described is starkest. In Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, Engels explains that the Habsburg absolutism balanced the feudal landlords and the, quote, large stock-jobbing capitalists, end quote, against each other while keeping both tied to the state power by class economic interests. Quote, thus Metternich was sure of the support of the two most powerful and influential classes of the empire, and Metternich possessed, besides, an army and a bureaucracy which, for all purposes of absolutism, could not be better constituted. The civil and military officers in the Austrian service form a race of their own. The civil and military officers in the Austrian service's fathers have been in the service of the Kaiser, and so will their sons be. The civil and military officers in the Austrian service belong to none of the multifarious nationalities congregated under the wing of the double-headed eagle. They are, and ever have been, removed from one end of the empire to the other. ... They have no nationality, but rather they alone make up the really Austrian nation. It is evident what a pliable and at the same time powerful instrument in the hands of an intelligent and energetic chief such a civil and military hierarchy must be, end quote. Engels, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. Here it is emphasized that the state bureaucracy, however derived originally, has been torn from the state bureaucracy's roots in civil society, both class roots and national roots, and turned into an order of janissaries, beholden only to the state power. It is an extreme form taken by autonomization. If Engels used the conveniently vague race in the old meaning of any classification of people for this social formation, we also find resort to the elastic word caste. In an 1858 article, Marx discussed the class position of the Prussian Landräte, landowners appointed as crown officials, the highest government representatives in their districts. Quote, these Landräte combine, therefore, in the Landräte's persons, the quality of the Krautjunker, parenthesis, fox hunter, end parenthesis, and the bureaucrat, end quote. Footnote. In this jocular definition, Marx, writing in English, is equating the Prussian rural aristocrat, quote, cabbage junker, end quote, with the English country squire. It is an approximation, of course, as he noted elsewhere. And footnote. The Landräte do not live on their state salaries. Quote, generally, therefore, the Landräte's interests are more strictly bound up with the class and party interests of the landed aristocracy than with the caste interests of the bureaucracy, end quote. Marx. I forget. Oh, I can't tell what this word is for. It's an article from 1858. Here the case is farthest away from that of the Austrian Janissaries. This Prussian part-time, quote, bureaucrat not only has his provenance in the aristocracy, he still lives primarily as an integral part of the class milieu, based on land ownership, not state ownership. And by this time, as we have seen, even the central bureaucracy was well on the way to bourgeoisification. This bureaucracy was déclassé, displaced from its class role as a whole. While it was increasingly difficult to think of it as a class, it was still a something. While it was increasingly difficult to think of this bureaucracy as a class, this bureaucracy was still a something. New section. Section 6. Caste or class. Caste or class. Again, we must deal with a terminological aspect, not because this terminological aspect was important to Marx, but for the contrary reason. Marx is so indifferent to the finicky choice between class or caste that Marx left plenty of room for latter-day Marxology to blow the matter up to huge proportions. As against a modern propensity to consider Marx's terminology, often taken anachronistically, as the key to Marx's conception, we must emphasize it is only his conception that explains his terminology. Another element too often ignored is the usage of the times. Since the late Enlightenment brought a vogue for things Indian, caste, including its combinations like caste spirit, or caste mentality, and so on, had come into wide currency as a swear word directed especially against old regime strata seen as fossilized, such as the old nobility, officer elite, and so on, as well as the bureaucracy. This pop sociological or journalistic usage existed alongside the technical or narrow meaning of caste in Hindu society. As in other cases, both meanings are to be found in Marx. In addition, there is a third aspect to the imported term that is important to understand. The underlying problem is that, while Marx could and did apply his own conception of social class, taken objectively, to avoid any period of history, the drawing of class lines of demarcation through civil society does not at all exclude other lines of demarcation within the same society. Thus, at various times, Marx considers color lines, other racial or ethnic lines, occupational lines, and so on, as lines of demarcation, and these have a certain relationship to the basic class lines. But history shows another and very important way of drawing lines of demarcation through a given civil society, namely, the way in which a society officially establishes such divisions for that society's self. the way in which a society officially establishes such divisions for that society's self. In various social systems, these divisions have been called estates, Stände, Etat, orders. For example, equestrian order, castes, and so on. 3 points may usefully be made about this terminological problem. 1. As distinct from the Marxian category of class, the contemporaneous labels, estates, and so on, typically denoted social divisions whose boundaries were fixed or recognized juridically. Established or enforced by political legal means with openly accepted sanctions. Whatever the means or the degree of rigidity, the boundaries thus demarcated were a refraction, but not necessarily a reproduction, of the objective lines of social division that underlay the society's consciousness. They were conditioned by the class divisions, possibly related ethnic divisions, for example, conqueror and conquered, sometimes occupational divisions, and so on. The contemporaneous labels marked a pattern of juridical orders, which lay athwart the pattern of social classes. Capitalism finally does away with this duality. Quote, bourgeois society knows only classes. Quote, bourgeois society knows only classes, end quote. Engels noted when he had to explain in 1885 the meaning of a passage written by Marx in 1847 about estates and classes. Engels was echoing Marx's words of 1849. Bourgeois society as such involves no class-like formations or privileged orders that are juridically established with relation to the production process and the appropriation of the surplus product, exceptions being recognizable as pre-bourgeois survivals. If bourgeois society knows only classes, pre-bourgeois society knew the duality. The famous roll call of classes at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto is not, in fact, a list of classes only. It loosely mixes classes in the Marxist sense with juridical orders in the contemporaneous sense. For example, patrician and plebeian were recognized orders of Roman society, and the plebeian order incubated more than one class. This same freedom in mixing the two terminologies characterizes the next paragraph too. 2. In Marx and Engels' writings, social formations that are classes in the Marxist sense are also freely given the other label, the one which is specific or indigenous to the social system in question. The most common case in point involves class and estate, Stand, with respect to feudalism. Thus, from the standpoint of Marx's historical analysis, the landed aristocracy was a class under feudalism. The landed aristocracy was also a feudal Stand, or estate, from the standpoint of the contemporaneous social structure. Marx freely calls the landed aristocracy one or the other, a caste or a class, depending on the context, without risk of being misunderstood. It would be quite senseless to ask whether Marx thought the aristocracy was a class or an estate. The relation between class and estate has its complications, but they offer little difficulty. For example, before 1789, the young French bourgeoisie ranked as part of a feudal estate, the third estate. On the other hand, the first estate of the realm, the high clergy, was part of a class in social reality. The estate system was rooted in the objective class structure, but the two patterns of division were not necessarily congruent. Marx, writing for contemporaries who did not need to have this explained, sometimes used one framework, sometimes the other, like everyone else. Hence what seemed to be loose usages to us were often merely idioms of the day. 3. Under the absolutist regime, the state bureaucracy was seen as one of the estates of the realm, but it was also seen as a social class. This depends not on some supra-historical definition of class, but on the concrete nature of the social system involved. The way in which a given society divides up into classes is specific to its own social relations. Thus, there are warlord elements in many societies, but a warlord becomes a feudal lord or baron, only when specific social relationships become dominant. There is no rule of thumb definition which decides whether the chief of an armed band who resides in a stronghold and lives off the surplus labor of unfree producers, etc., is or is not a member of a feudal class. The point can be settled only by the point can be settled not by a glossary, but only by a concrete examination of the overall social relations of the society. Similarly, merchants become a separate class, not simply because merchants buy and sell, but only when buying and selling begins to play a certain role in a given society. Footnote. This point is closely related to Marx's explanation of how other socioeconomic categories take on class character only in the context of a given social system. Thus, quote, a Negro is a Negro. He only becomes a slave in certain relations. A cotton-spinning jenny is a machine for spinning cotton. A cotton-spinning jenny becomes capital only in certain relations. Torn from these relations, a cotton-spinning jenny is no more capital than gold in itself is money, or sugar the price of sugar. End quote. Marx. End footnote. And that quote's from what? Marx, Wage, Labor, and Capital. End footnote. Likewise, state bureaucracy always describes a formation of government officials, of course, but an officialdom enters into differing social relations depending on what societal whole it functions in. We have already explained that to ask whether the bureaucracy is a class in some supra-historical sense, that is, apart from the social relations of a specific system, is quite as pointless as to ask whether the aristocracy was a class or an estate. It should now be possible to understand what is implicit in a passage Marx wrote in 1849. A pro-government writer, expounding a supra-historical view of classes as fixed for all time, had argued that wherever there was, quote, labor and division of labor, end quote, there were necessarily class differences, for which reason the worker-bourgeois relationship could never be abolished. Marx replied, quote, in Egypt there was labor and division of labor and castes. In Greece and Rome, labor and division of labor, and freemen and slaves. In the Middle Ages, labor and division of labor, and feudal lords and serfs, corporations, estates, and the like. Feudal lords and serfs, corporations, estates, and the like. In our era, there is labor and division of labor, and classes. One of these classes being in possession of all the instruments of production and means of livelihood, while the other lives only by selling its labor. ... End quote. Marx in Neue Rheinische Zeitung, 21st of January, 1849, in a piece on Montesquieu. Here, caste is used coordinately with class and estate. Caste is to ancient Egypt what the estate is to feudalism. It is the juridically demarcated social formation that is specific to the society, one of the contemporaneous social divisions that lie athwart the underlying class division. Marx did not have available any agreed-on generic term to denote this family of social formations, no umbrella term marking what is common to a state, caste, order, and so on. There is still none in common acceptance today. In addition, the word estate is especially ambiguous in English. For example, when Engels wanted to refer to the estates of pre-1848 Prussia for American readers, Engels' solution in one article was to call them, quote, social ranks or castes, end quote. And, quote, these castes were, quote, estates of the realm, end quote, end quote. Engels, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. Does this mean Engels thought the feudal estates were castes? Does this mean that Engels thought the feudal estates were castes? Not at all. As often, caste was simply a stand-in for something without a tag of its own. Contrariwise, in Anti-Durning, Engels referred in passing to the, quote, system of social estates, end quote. Ständegliederung, in the, quote, heroic epoch, end quote, of ancient Greece. Does this mean Engels thought there were feudal estates in the Homeric age? Of course not, as Engels' accounts of this society show elsewhere. Ständegliederung should be translated as any order, Ständegliederung should be translated as any ordered arrangement of social ranks. For Stände, then, and today often, has this broader generic meaning. Footnote. It is interesting that in his book, Historical Materialism, realizing the need, Bukharin adopted caste as his generic term for a juridically established legal political category, hence inclusive of a state. He wrote inter alia, quote, in ancient Egypt, the administration of production was practically identical with that of the state, the great landlords heading both. An important fraction of production was that turned out by the landlord state. The role of the social groups in production coincided with their caste, with whether they were higher, middle, or lower officials of the state or slaves, ... End quote. Bukharin. This is one of the many cases where caste has been detached from the narrow meaning based on its Hindu form and more or less arbitrarily invested with some broader meaning for purposes of sociological analysis. More often than not, however, Marx himself used caste with some relation to the narrow sense, especially in his scientific economic writings. Since Marx refers to Egypt more than to India in this connection, it should be mentioned that later Egyptologists rejected the earlier view of, quote, the Egyptian system of caste, end quote, as Marx called it in Capital. On the other hand, for example, in Marx's 18th Brumaire, Marx applied the caste label to Louis Bonaparte's inflated bureaucracy as a, quote, artificial caste, end quote, which was created by the head of the state. It is contrasted with, quote, the actual classes of society, end quote. Here the term caste is obviously a stand-in, as often, and has no relation to the Indian social formation. End footnote. Estate and caste, as well as rank order, and the like, have occasionally functioned as generics pointing to any kind of class-like formation, leaving open the specifics. The kind of exegesis, therefore, that stresses how frequently Marx and Engels called a bureaucracy a class or a caste is not very helpful. By and large, these usages follow the circumstances of the time. Consider the following three passages in Engels. 1. In 1850, Engels remarked of the 1849 campaign in Germany that, quote, the reactionary classes, aristocracy, bureaucracy, and big bourgeoisie were few in number, end quote. Engels. The bureaucracy, specifically the bureaucracy of the absolutist monarchy, is called one of the classes without inhibition. 2. In 1872, as we have already quoted, Engels wrote that, quote, both in the old absolute monarchy and in the modern Bonapartist monarchy, the real governmental authority lies in the hands of a special caste of army officers and state officials, end quote. Engels. Housing question. Three. In 1884, describing the 1848 revolution, Engels listed, quote, the absolute monarchy, feudal land ownership, the bureaucracy, and the cowardly petty bourgeoisie, end quote, as adversaries of the German bourgeoisie. The bureaucracy is here implicitly regarded as part of the class structure of 1848, separate from the monarchy as a social force, at that, but no labels are applied. These usages did not involve a change in Engels' conception of the socio-political role played by the autonomized state bureaucracy in the recent past. But something else did change during the decades between the first and last of the above statements. As Germany developed with rapid strides from the semi-absolutist, semi-Bonapartist monarchy to a modern bourgeois society, then, as we have discussed, the bureaucracy was accordingly subordinated to bourgeois power, hence downgraded from its previous height of autonomization as a class, caste, or a state, becoming a subaltern, quote, social stratum, end quote. It certainly was still visible as a distinctive social category, but it could no longer be viewed as playing an autonomous class role. By 1884, calling the old bureaucracy of the absolutist period a class, in a historical sense, would have required an explanation for the contemporaneous reader. Back in 1850, no explanation had been necessary as a matter of course. New section, Section 7, Bureaucratic Hypertrophy. There is another question that has to be put in its place. This question concerns the distinction already mentioned between bureaucratization as the necessary accompaniment of a state and class society and over-bureaucratization as a pathological symptom. The phenomenon of bureaucratic hypertrophy is, of course, very old, antedating even the swollen state machine of the later Roman Empire, and is in no way limited to any one type of class society. It is especially typical of the fatty degeneration stage of any class society, and reached a new peak in the Ancien regime as the feudal class lay in its death throes and the young bourgeoisie grew to adolescence. Thus bourgeois political consciousness, arising amidst the rank overgrowths of the absolute monarchies, grew up with a certain hostility to, quote, statism, a frame of mind which produced the laissez-faire ideology in its moderate form and bourgeois anarchism in its extreme form. It is interesting that the same Frenchman, Vincent de Gournay, is credited with inventing both the term bureaucracy and the phrase laissez-faire, laissez-passer in the 18th century. However, the tendency to state gigantism tended to reproduce itself in the bourgeois state too, just as in previous class societies. This is a tendency which worked itself out at different rates and in more or less offensive forms, depending on country and period. Above all, it is necessary to keep in mind that even where a tendency is itself inevitable, given certain social developments, the particular manifestations in which it takes form are not inevitable, as individual phenomena, and indeed usually seem to be highly avoidable and remediable if only the leaders were wiser, or whatever, especially in small-scale cases. If, therefore, one asks whether a particular problem of bureaucratism or over-bureaucratization is rooted in the system or merely adventitious, the question may be ambiguous. Any given case of bureaucratic excess may be avoidable, but not so the tendency that some such phenomena will be generated. Cases of bureaucratism naturally attracted Marx's and Engels' pens. The army bureaucracy provided examples galore for Engels' military writings. The Crimean War was a rich source, perhaps the most notorious case being the disastrous administration and logistics of the British forces, taught by the famous blunder that launched the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava, which Engels wrote up at the time. More important than the fact that, quote, someone had blundered, end quote, was the decimation of the British Army by the incompetence of its own bureaucracy. The scapegoat, wrote Engels, is Lord Raglan, Raglan, Raglan. Quote, but this is not just. We are no admirers of his lordship's military conduct and have criticized Lord Raglan's blunders with freedom, but truth requires us to say that the terrible evils amid which the soldiers in the Crimea are perishing are not Lord Raglan's fault, but that of the system on which the British war establishment is administered. End quote. Engels, British Disaster, published in New York Tribune, 22nd of January, 1855. This introduces an article which details, quote, this beautiful system of administration, ... This machinery so well adapted to fetter generals and to ruin armies, end quote. Marx followed after a British investigation commission had reported, with a more comprehensive study of the fossilized routinism of bureaucratism. A typical passage, quote, the regulations were so beautifully arranged that, a typical passage, quote, the regulations were so beautifully arranged that, nobody knew where his authority began nor where it ceased, nor to whom to apply for anything, and thus, from a wholesome fear of responsibility, everybody shifted everything from his own shoulders to those of somebody else. Under this system, the hospitals were scenes of infamous brutality, ... and the authors of all these horrors and abominations are no hard-hearted barbarians. They are, every one of them, British gentlemen of good extraction, well-educated, and of mild, philanthropic, and religious dispositions. In their individual capacity, they no doubt were ready and willing to do anything. In their official capacity, their duty was to look coolly and with folded arms upon all these infamies, conscious that the case was not provided for in any part of Her Majesty's regulations affecting themselves, ... Not a man on the spot had the energy to break through the network of routine, to act upon his own responsibility as the necessities of the case demanded, and in the teeth of the regulations. The only party who has dared to do this is a woman, Miss Nightingale, end quote. Marx, something about the British Army in New York Tribune, 14th of April, 1855. End footnote. Raglan, Marx dismissed as, quote, all his life a head office clerk, to Wellington, a man bred to do just as he was bid, end quote. Other high officers, quote, are well-bred, good-looking gentlemen whose elegance of manner and refinement of feeling do not permit them to handle a thing roughly or to act with even a show of decision, end quote. Marx. But we must now note that Marx did not draw the conclusion that these particular bureaucratic horrors flowed inevitably from the social system, though a connection was obvious. On the contrary, Marx predicted flatly and accurately that, since the system could not afford these indulgences to its inherent tendencies, quote, it is impossible that there should not be a reform in the system and administration of the British Army, end quote. Marx. For this situation can be taken as a classic example of a bureaucratic foul-up which, while visibly the outcome of tendencies inherent in the class structure, yet had to be and could be remedied in the short run, even if plugging the hole in one place meant that the same tendency would burst out elsewhere. The same can be said of instances of the bureaucratic mentality, which are usually removable in retail and inescapable in wholesale. Footnote. Perhaps the purest case of a reaction to bureaucratic mentality and tone alone is provided by the tale of Engels and the librarian. In the 1860s, Engels became active in the German Cultural Center of Manchester, the Schiller Institute. In fact, Engels became president between 1864 and 1868 and remained on its executive till Engels moved to London. One day in 1861, Engels received a curt form letter from the Institute librarian about returning a book. Its form and tone, the request itself not being in question, ignited Engels, and Engels fired a missive at the executive protesting the brutal style of communication. Quote, in fact, when I read the document, I thought I had been suddenly translated back to the homeland, end quote. It was like, quote, a peremptory summons from some German police commissioner, end quote. Engels. Engels then looked back at one of the founding documents of the Institute, 1859, and flared up again, quote, it said that Schiller Institute should serve to make, quote, the young German feel immediately at home here, be better taken care of and provided for morally and spiritually, and above all return home unestranged from the fatherland, end quote. Beyond question, the bureaucratic style of this sort of official communication is quite calculated to make the recipient feel immediately on home soil, and forced to believe that he is as well, if not, quote, better taken care of and provided for, end quote, than at home in his beloved patriarchal police state, that great institution for the care of little children. As long as this sort of official communication flourishes, there is certainly not the least danger that any member of the Schiller Institute will be estranged from the fatherland. Yes, indeed, if by exception some member had not yet had occasion at home to get acquainted with the forms of the bureaucratic civil service and the peremptory way of speaking of the authorities, the Schiller Institute would seem to offer him the best opportunity to do so. To be sure, many members have hardly allowed themselves to suppose that, quote, the German spirit in the fullest sense of the word, end quote, for whose cultivation the Schiller Institute is to be the center, also comprises that spirit of bureaucratism, which at home unfortunately still holds almost all political power, which all Germany is fighting, winning victory after victory just at this time, This tone of direct command, these peremptory summonses to restore order within 24 hours are out of place here anyway. ... End quote. Engels. End footnote. That's funny. We've seen other instances of Marx's attention to the development of bureaucratization in England, particularly in the form of British colonial machinery for the control of India. Still, it was not England that was the hearth of state bureaucratism. Indeed, well past the middle of the century, the islanders regarded the new word bureaucracy as the name of a foreign phenomenon known to be rife on the continent. The visible vanguard of bureaucratization in Western Europe was constituted by France and Prussia. The two went together. When Marx refers to the Prussian bureaucracy as, quote, that omnipotent, all-meddling parasitic body, end quote, the context is a comparison with, quote, the France of Louis Philippe, end quote. Elsewhere, comparing the state expenditures of France with England's, Marx notes that, quote, in a bureaucratic country like France, the cost of collecting the revenue grows at a rate disproportionate to the amount of the revenue itself, end quote. Marx. It was mainly in connection with this bureaucratic country par excellence, especially under Bonapartism, that Marx uses the catchword state parasite and similar expressions. The reference above to the, quote, parasitic Prussian bureaucracy is an exception. It is significant that it was written in 1858, that is, well past the heyday of the old absolutist bureaucracy, when this social holdover was taking on an anachronistic look in critical eyes. To be sure, Marx's occasional use of the epithet or metaphor parasite is always made offhand and never becomes a statement on the subject, let alone a theory. For the most part, it underlines the unproductiveness or over-bureaucratized sectors of the state machinery. Later, in the Civil War in France and its drafts, where the elimination of the state as such is under discussion, it may also suggest the dispensability of any state as an instrument of class oppression. Footnote: in Special Note D, a closer examination is given to Marx's use of the phrase state parasite. End footnote. But what is mainly wrong with a sober-sided effort to read portentous theoretical conceptions into a phrase like state parasite is that it misses the main point. Marx's critics usually like to point out that Marx not only had a theory about capitalism, he was so deficient in his academic objectivity that he hated capitalism with a passionate detestation. When, therefore, they read in Marx about, quote, capitalist vermin and bourgeois, quote, bloodsuckers, and so on, these phrases do not move them to break out with the discovery that Marx held a theory of the increasing verminosis of capitalism. Indeed, they cry shame at such blatantly unscientific language, for everyone knows the said critics have a perfectly unemotional detachment about the social powers they live under. Likewise, with state parasite as an imprecation against the bureaucracy, Marx labored under the complication of feeling passionate hostility to everything the state bureaucracy represented. It was not merely an institution to be studied, but an enemy to be fought. The two aims were not contradictory and had to be studied in order to be fought effectively. In the hour when hatred of the bureaucracy was not merely a political idea, but a matter of day-to-day agitation, that is, in the 1848-49 revolution, Marx's articles are already studded with castigation of the, quote, ox-heads of the arrogant bureaucracy with upturned noses, end quote, and the like, and it called to an active, quote, distrust of the executive bureaucrats, end quote, on generalized grounds. In short, in Marx, the bureaucracy is a social formation, not simply bureaucratism, is a dirty word from very early on. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.